At the same time, in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, we're also seeing in the UK the rise of the eugenics movement. Now, some of you may have heard of eugenics, some of you may not. And it was essentially like a pseudo-scientific theory that believed that you could apply the principles of Mendelian inheritance theory to human populations. Now, Gregor Mendel, who Mendelian inheritance is named after, was amongst other things a biologist, and he studied pea plants to see how the characteristics of parent plants were transferred or not to their offspring. Essentially, he identifies that certain characteristics could be classed as dominant characteristics and that these would overpower what he called recessive characteristics to be present in the offspring, even if one of the parent plants did not have this dominant characteristic. Now, for the most part, Mendel's principles are ignored outside of things like cattle breeding. But in 1883, a British scientist called Francis Galton tries to apply these same principles to human populations. So where Mendel was looking at plants and animals and saying, well, if these two groups of characteristics breed, this is what the offspring is going to look like. Galton is instead asking, what does it look like when these two kinds of humans breed? Now, obviously, this has really explosive implications because Galton's theorizing is essentially trying to categorize good and bad stock in human populations in the same way that good and bad stock would be categorized in, say, cows. So the logical follow-through of these categorization efforts is that the presence of bad human stock within your population will lead to the degradation of the health of the whole stock, since the bad stock can do things like expose the good stock to diseases, or if, God forbid, they interbreed, they then produce inferior stock, etc., etc. Now, Galton is by no means the first person to raise the alarm about quote-unquote interbreeding. In fact, concerns about sexual relationships between, for example, black men and white women motivate many of the first laws governing slave colonies in the 1600s. For more on that, listen back to the episode on strong women. But he is reviving this idea and expressing it in the new, shiny, and legitimate language of scientific theory. For more on the power on scientific language, listen back to the episode on mental health. So let's combine these two things. On the one hand, we have pre-existing concerns about the physical health of the British population thrown into sharp relief by the Second Boer War. On the other hand, we have this new movement of eugenics, which is coating this prejudice against foreign bodies with the illusion of scientific rigor. Both of these things are combining to frame incoming foreigners as not just foreign, but as fundamentally dangerous to the existence of the native population. In fact, the Eugenics Education Society of Britain, founded in 1907, would explicitly study the alleged health impacts on the British public of Jewish migrant populations of London's East End for at least 2 decades following the passage of the 1905 Aliens Act. There's also a third factor, which is really accentuating these concerns about the immigration of Eastern European Jews, and that is British emigration. So the outward flow of people from Britain. Emigration was actively encouraged as part of imperialism because one of the key logics that underpins imperialism is this belief in the supremacy of imperial power. This belief that the imperial power knows best, meaning that the imperial power had not even a right but a duty to govern over foreign populations through the imperial structure. And who better to run that imperial structure but the British people? So, emigration had long since been actively encouraged as part of Britain's colonizing mission. But in the context of fears about immigration, emigration poses an even more substantial threat because it's not even just that, the bad stock is arriving, but there's also less of the quote-unquote good stock present in the country to dilute this effect. And this is the logic that informs Leonard Darwin's comments in 1919, Leonard being the son of famed geneticist Charles Darwin, when he says, "Immigration and emigration certainly stand first for consideration amongst imperial problems, for we all see the importance of keeping up the quality of human marble which we are constantly exporting, and of seeing that this export does not reduce the quality of human stone, which will have to be used in future for the building of our own nation." So essentially he's saying, we should be exporting our best people, our human marble, to ensure that we can resolve imperial problems. But we shouldn't export so many of them that we can't produce new best people. We should make sure that our stock or quality of human stone is sufficient to replenish reserves. So like pretty big yikes to that. But that's the history and context of Britain's first immigration law.